So moving on then in the critique of judgment to the analytic of the sublime, we saw then that, to recap, with respect to the beautiful, we saw how the category of aesthetical judgment was plugged into the four categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. And with regard to the beautiful and the category of quantity, we saw that the judgments regarding the beautiful were universally valid for everyone. With regard to quality, they had they aroused a disinterested pleasure. With regard to relation, they had a subjective purposiveness, and with regard to modality, they had a necessary satisfaction. So that was the results of plugging in the aesthetical judgments about the beautiful into the fourfold architectonic, the classical Kantian schema. He's going to do the same thing now for judgment, which he's going to divide into two halves: the mathematical and the mathematical and the dynamical. The mathematically sublime will have to do with the expansion of space. The sublime, insofar as it has to do with magnitude, ever-increasing magnitudes, and with the dynamically sublime, which will be the first one, mathematical, has to do with the categories of quantity and quality. The dynamical has to do with the categories of relation and modality, in which it will be concerned with power, with might, as Kant puts it. So, and he defines the sublime. He says the sublime is that which, by comparison with which, everything else is small. So it is the absolutely great, the greatest thing, than which nothing can compare. And everything else measured by it is small. And he also says that with respect to the beautiful, when the mind apprehends the beautiful, it is in a state of restful contemplation. But with the sublime, the apprehension of the sublime, the mind is in a state of agitation. It's not in a state of rest. There is a pleasure derived from this agitation, nonetheless, but it is an agitation. And then so when he moves into the discussion and plugs it into the first category, the mathematically sublime, the first category, and the main category, really, of which is quantity, since his comments with regard to quality are really just an appendix for the comments on quantity, which have to do with spatial magnitude, is that with regard to the imagination, there is a certain degree in which, with the beautiful, we had the imagination in a certain harmonious alliance with the understanding. Even though it had nothing to do with concepts, but there was a certain compatibility and harmony between them. Whereas with the sublime, the imagination now will be at odds with the reason. So the reason will be involved. The reason, recall, always demands totalities, cosmologically totalistic images. And so the imagination now, with the sublime, will be tasked to keep up with the demands of the law of reason to progress into totalities. And so there will be a problem, a discord between them. And he says that the imagination then proceeds by, there are two operations by means of which it proceeds: apprehension and comprehension. Apprehension is that which simply is the apprehension of magnitudes that can keep on proceeding to infinity. That's an apprehension. But the comprehension cannot necessarily keep pace with the imagination's apprehension. And if it doesn't keep pace with it, it breaks down at a certain point, and the magnitude just keeps going on past the point where the human mind can comprehend it. He says, compare this with the Egyptian pyramids, which would be, of course, the sublime represented in an architectural monument, although it's not a pure example of the sublime. He says, if you're too far away from the pyramids, he says, then you cannot apprehend the relationship of the parts to each other so that they have no aesthetic effect on you. But then if you're too close to them, as you move from the bottom to looking at the top, as your imagination apprehends and moves along, it forgets the lower parts and doesn't have them in a complete, the apprehension is never completed, and so the comprehension doesn't follow. You don't get a complete effect or a comprehension from the full apprehension of the ascent of the pyramids. So you have to be at just the right distance from them in order for apprehension and comprehension to be in accord. And so that's the problem with the method. He does say, though, that with regard to architecture and buildings, they're not pure examples of the sublime, even though we would think that they would be. A Gothic cathedral or an Egyptian pyramid should be examples of the sublime in terms of massive spatial expansion. But he says that the problem with them is that they're tied up with human purpose. And remember that he wants to keep purpose out of aesthetics. He wants to keep, because purpose is bound up with concepts, of the good and the useful, and he wants to keep it out. So judgments regarding the sublime in works of human civilization are not pure. It's still sublime, but they're not pure examples of it for him. And then so we have this conflict, and then he gives the between reason and the imagination, where reason wants a totality. Reason wants everything given in a single intuition, but the imagination can never keep up. And so what happens is, he says, in mathematics, the imagination can keep ascending toward infinity, and the understanding can provide the units of measure, the mathematical units of measure that can keep up with it, but only to the point where comprehension breaks down. But the reason wants totality. It always tasks the imagination to produce a total image. And he says the final image of this first part of the discussion is, he says that the sublime then in nature, imagine the size of a tree by reference to a man. The tree is larger than the man. Now imagine the tree in reference to the mountains. And if the mountain was a mile high, we might be able to use it as a standard of reference for the diameter of the earth, which in turn we could use as a standard of reference for the solar system, which in turn we could use as a standard of reference for the Milky Way, and so on. And he says that the sublime is not so much the additional magnitudes as it is the fact that for each addition, there's always something else beyond it. You can always keep on going, and that's the sublime. That is the expansion through infinite space. That is, of course, the essence of Faustian civilization. As Spengler pointed out, Faustian civilization is the civilization par excellence that is associated with the obsession with infinite space. And it's a civilization that's bound up with the sublime, the same way that Hindu civilization is fascinated with the sublime, but the other sublime, the dynamically sublime, not the mathematically sublime. Our Western civilization is obsessed with the mathematically sublime. The Hindu civilization, Kant doesn't say any of this, but it's obvious to extrapolate from it. The Hindu civilization is obsessed with the dynamically sublime, that is to say, the great powers of nature that blow mere human systems of ratiocination to pieces. Shiva is the great god of the sublime, who is utterly hostile to all human endeavors and undertakings. He is the god of the infinite powers of the universe, the god of death and destruction, and who laughs at our endeavors. Whereas the Greeks, on the other hand, were a civilization concerned neither with the mathematically sublime of space nor the dynamically sublime of power, but with the beautiful. It's the Greek. Everything in Greek civilization is small, miniature, scaled down to human proportions, and beautiful, so that the mind apprehends the beautiful in a state of restful contemplation. The sublime is in there, as Nietzsche intuited. He found the Dionysian elements in there, but they had been covered up. They're part of older Greece. They extend back into Neolithic Greece, into the time of human sacrifice, and so forth, that the Greeks repressed and covered up with the Apollonian facade of the beautiful. It took a Faustian genius like Nietzsche to intuit that the sublime was in there and hidden in Dionysian form all along. And then so Kant moves on then in his discussion from quantity to quality, and he talks about now, once again, with regard to quality, he goes back to this conflict between the imagination and reason. That reason is always urging us toward total images, but the imagination, precisely because its two operations of apprehension and comprehension can't keep up with each other, can never match the tasks set by reason. And so the sublime, unlike the beautiful, produces a discord, a kind of pain within us. It is nonetheless bound up with a certain pleasure. It's a sort of pleasure-pain thing that is bound up within us. Whereas when he had plugged in the aesthetical judgments regarding the beautiful into the category of quality, he had talked about how the beautiful had to do with disinterested pleasure. Here, when he plugs the sublime and judgments about the sublime into the category of quality, what results is not pleasure but pain. And in this case, in the previous case, it had been the harmony between the imagination and the understanding. Here, it's the discord between the imagination and the ideas of the reason. There's a fundamental discord there, and from that tension, there arises a certain pain. The sublime does violence to human ideas, to human civilization, to human ideas about magnitudes and measures. It does violence to all of our ideas. It has to do with the monstrous in nature, those aspects of nature which have a tendency toward the infinite in terms of power and in terms of space. And so in art, if we were looking at examples of the sublime in painting, we would think of the great landscapes of the American Romantic painters like Thomas Cole and Frederick Church. Frederick Church's great painting. The Cotopaxi, for example, is a classic example of the sublime in nature, where he depicts a primordial landscape and the Cotopaxi volcano devoid of human habitation, and it's this giant vision of a landscape with an erupting volcano, huge, enormous waterfalls. And note, though, that in a painting like that, and here's the problem with a philosopher, is that for philosophers, everything is neat and clean. There are always crisp and clear bounded edges between everything. But in the realm of actual art, it's never that simple. These things are always interlocked, such as the very phrase sublimely beautiful suggests. That in Kant's world would be an oxymoron. But I think the Cotopaxi, as painted by Frederick Church, is indeed sublimely beautiful. It's an image of the mathematical sublime because it shows us this vast expanse of space, and the dynamical sublime because of this, the genesis forces of the geomorphic forces of the Earth's crust as expressed through the volcanic activities and the waterfalls. But it is also nonetheless beautiful. It is a beautifully executed painting. And so we have all three aesthetic categories there. The beautiful and the two types of sublime are all intermixed in that image, as they are in quite a few of the great American romantic landscape painters of the 19th century. And so Kant's categories break down when you begin to roll out real, actual works of art. And he has a failing in this text to provide examples. That is one of the great failures of German philosophers in general, is that they don't give concrete examples. And Kant doesn't give very many concrete examples at all. But suffice it to say, that's the first half of the discussion of the sublime, then, the sublime in terms of the mathematical sublime.